Welcome to the deep dive. We are going way back in time today, really far back.
Yeah, we're talking about a pretty critical and honestly turbulent time in Earth's history. That period between about 1,000 and 541 million years ago.
Right. This is the era that had these massive globe-spanning ice ages, but it's maybe more famous for, well, setting the stage for the Cambrian explosion, the big boom in complex life.
Exactly. And for decades, scientists have mostly relied on indirect clues to figure out what triggered these huge changes. The standard thinking, the established wisdom, was that life really took off because the ocean had built up this enormous kind of nutritional safety net.
Huh. But it turns out the actual key to unlocking this, maybe rewriting this ancient story, was hiding in plain sight. It's something that sounds really ordinary.
You wouldn't believe it. Tiny stones, they look just like regular sand grains.
Okay, so that's our source material today. This groundbreaking research from ETH scientists, I think led by Professor Jordan Hemingway. And they use these tiny minerals, they're called ooids, as direct time capsules.
It really is like a detective story. And the mission, for you listening, is to sort of get how these tiny, tiny relics let researchers directly measure the amount of dissolved organic carbon DOC, they call it, in the ancient ocean, like for the very first time.
And here's the twist, right? The aha moment that just flips the script. This direct measurement, it completely challenges that foundational theory we mentioned.
Totally. The old idea was this huge overflowing reserve of DOC basically fueled the evolutionary jump.
But the new data shows the complete opposite. So today we're going to unpack why this finding just contradicts everything we thought we knew, and importantly, what it means for how Earth cycles its basic building blocks.
Yeah, we're essentially overturning a major geological and biological explanation, and this time it's based on, actual physical proof, not just interpretations of weird rock layers. It definitely raises the stakes for understanding how planets like ours work, how resilient they are.
Okay, let's dig into these time capsules then. These ooids, you said they're made of iron oxide, and they're like nature's historians. That sounds simple, but how do they actually form and, protect these secrets for like over 1 billion years?
Well, the mechanism is actually what makes them so perfect for this. They're not just random bits of sand. They form almost like tiny geological pearls, or maybe snowballs is a better analogy.
Snowballs, okay.
Yeah, they start with a tiny core, a nucleus, maybe a grain of sand or a shell fragment, and then as waves roll them back and forth on the seafloor, layer upon layer of minerals slowly build up around that core.
I see. Like rolling a snowball in wet snow.
Exactly. And it's these layers that trap the information. We can actually track carbon levels in these layers going back, believe it or not, 1.65 billion years.
Wait a second. If they're iron oxide, how does the carbon get trapped? Does it like stick to the iron somehow and get locked in? Is that the time capsule part?
Precisely. As those mineral layers precipitate out of the seawater, organic carbon molecules that are just floating around, they stick to the surface. Then the next layer forms over them, locking them into that stable mineral structure.
Yeah.
And that iron oxide matrix, it's incredibly tough. It protects that ancient carbon signature from being messed up by later geological processes. That's how Hemingway's team could reconstruct the carbon levels so accurately.
Right. That durability is key. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Why is measuring this dissolved organic carbon, this DOC, why is it so critical? Why did scientists spend decades trying to guess its past levels? What is this stuff?
So think of DOC as this huge nutritional soup in the ocean. It's basically all the organic building blocks for life. Simple sugars, more complex compounds, all that stuff just dissolved and drifting freely in the water.
Okay, like a pantry for microbes.
Kind of, but on a massive scale. To give you an idea, this dissolved reservoir today holds about 200 times more carbon than is actually in all the living things in the ocean combined. Plankton, fish, whales, everything.
Whoa, 200 times. That's enormous.
It really is. It's absolutely central to the whole marine life support system.
So connecting this to the bigger picture, the carbon cycle.
Yeah.
How does carbon get into the ocean and create this massive bank account in the first place?
Okay, yeah, we can break it down. There are maybe 4 main ways. First, the simple one, CO2 just dissolves straight from the air into the seawater, basic chemistry.
Right.
Second, you have the producers, photosynthetic organisms, phytoplankton, marine bacteria. They use sunlight, and that dissolves CO2 to make the basic organic compounds. Photosynthesis.
Okay, makes sense. And then there's the life and death cycle. You mentioned something called marine snow.
Exactly. When these tiny organisms die, they slowly sink down. It looks a bit like underwater snow. hence the name marine snow. Now, if that snow makes it all the way to the deep seabed without being eaten or decomposing,
Then the carbon gets buried.
right, it gets stored geologically, potentially for millions of years. And the fourth process is decomposition. Microbes break down the dead stuff, releasing those organic carbon molecules back into the water as DOC, basically topping up the reservoir.
Got it. So it's this constant dance, right? Production, sinking, storing it away, and then recycling it back.
It is a dynamic balance. And for decades, the assumption, particularly about that key window, 1,000 to 541 million years ago, it was based on that indirect evidence we talked about.
The weird sedimentary rocks.
Yeah, anomalies in deep oceanic sedimentary rocks from that time. These rock formations, they suggested really unusual carbon burial rates. And from that, researchers inferred, they concluded, that the DOC reservoir must have been unusually full back then, really voluminous.
And that became the bedrock theory. That this huge carbon supply was the reason life suddenly got complex.
Pretty much. That assumption became the foundation for explaining how life suddenly had enough resources, enough building blocks to make that leap towards complexity, towards the Cambrian explosion.
So this idea of a giant, overflowing carbon bank in the ocean, it was basically a long-standing hypothesis, but built on, like, secondary clues. How solid did scientists think this theory was before this ooid research? Oh, the consensus was very strong. I mean, those sedimentary anomalies were persuasive, and honestly, a big nutrient-rich ocean seemed like the most logical explanation for the really dramatic things happening than, the first complex animals appearing, those crazy ice ages.
It fit the narrative.
It did. What Hemingway's team did was recognize that these ooids, they offered the first real chance to bypass all that inference, all the guesswork, and get a direct chemical snapshot of the actual seawater from back then.
And this is where it gets really dramatic, because that snapshot, that direct measurement, it delivered a staggering contradiction. Let's get to the result, the measurement that the sources say contradicts all previous assumptions. What did the carbon trapped in those ancient ooids actually show? Okay, brace yourself. They found that between 1,000 and 541 million years ago, the ocean didn't have an abundance of carbon at all. In fact, it contained 90 to 99% less dissolved organic carbon than our modern oceans do today.
Wait, 90 to 99% less?
Yeah.
That's not a small adjustment. That's basically throwing out the entire concept.
A complete reversal.
So the ocean was essentially starved of these vital building blocks right at the time life was supposedly gearing up for its biggest expansion. Can you give us, like, an analogy for that level of depletion? What does that practically mean?
Okay. Imagine if the modern DOC reservoir is like a global bank account holding, say, $660 billion.
Right.
Well, the primordial ocean during that critical time, it was running on pocket change, maybe just a few billion dollars equivalent, right before the biggest evolutionary spending spree in history. It just completely shifts our understanding of how that whole era worked.
Wow, that level of scarcity is just hard to grasp. So when did things change? When did this carbon reservoir start to fill up toward the levels we see today?
Well, what's really interesting is the timing. It seems directly linked to big changes in the atmosphere, specifically oxygen. The data suggests the ocean carbon reservoir only really started to rise significantly, eventually getting to that 660 billion tons we have now after the second major oxygenation event, the second oxygen catastrophe.
Okay, that connects us back to the oxygen revolutions. We know photosynthesis started pumping out oxygen that built up in the atmosphere in two big waves, right? And that second wave, maybe 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, that was key because life started using oxygen, developing oxygen-based metabolism.
Absolutely crucial. Using oxygen for metabolism is way, way more efficient for getting energy. It provides much more power. And that efficiency was thought to be the prerequisite, the necessary step for developing the first truly complex life forms like early animals.
Right. But the old theory assumed this complexity thrived because there was this huge soup of carbon building blocks ready to be used.
Exactly. That was the assumption. But the new data flatly contradicts that. It shows that complex life emerged and developed despite this profound scarcity of dissolved carbon. The cupboard was nearly bare.
Okay, so we're left with this massive geological puzzle. If that huge carbon reservoir wasn't actually there, we desperately need a new explanation for what was driving everything: the ice ages, the rise of complex life, the oxygen changes. Lead author Near Galilee said it clearly. We need new explanations. So what's the new theory? What could have caused such a massive, sharp drop in DOC back then?
The new theory is actually quite elegant in a way. It flips the cause and effect. The team suggests the crucial factor wasn't geochemistry driving biology, but biology driving geochemistry, specifically the emergence of larger organisms during that period.
Larger organisms, you mean like the first animals?
Not necessarily big animals as we think of them today, maybe not even animals initially, just larger single-celled organisms, maybe early multicellular forms, bigger than the tiny bacteria and archaea that dominated before.
Okay, but how does life just getting a bit bigger suddenly cause the amount of dissolved carbon in the entire ocean to plummet? That feels backward.
It comes down to sinking speed and recycling efficiency. Think about it. When organisms are really tiny, like bacteria, when they die, they sink incredibly slowly. They often get decomposed and recycled right near the surface, staying in the upper water column.
Right, they don't make it to the deep ocean floor quickly.
Exactly. But these newly evolved, slightly larger organisms, when they died, they sank much, much faster. Just basic physics, they're heavier, denser. This dramatically increased the amount and the speed of that marine snowfall reaching the deep ocean.
Okay, faster sinking. But why did that deplete the dissolved carbon?
Because of what the deep ocean was like back then, this is the key geochemical link. The deep sea during that era had very little dissolved oxygen. It was largely anoxic.
Ah, low oxygen. So the microbes down there couldn't break down the sinking stuff efficiently.
Precisely. In today's oxygen-rich deep ocean, aerobic microbes, the ones that use oxygen, they rapidly gobble up sinking particles, breaking them down and releasing the carbon back into the water as DOC. It's efficient recycling.
But without oxygen.
Without oxygen, decomposition relies on much slower, far less efficient anaerobic pathways. It basically grinds to a near halt in comparison. So those faster sinking particles from the larger organisms, they weren't effectively recycled back into dissolved carbon.
So they just piled up.
They settled relatively quickly onto the seafloor and got buried in the sediments. This continuous, highly efficient burial, driven by the evolution of larger life forms, sinking faster into an anoxic deep sea, acts like a giant pump, pulling carbon out of the dissolved reservoir and locking it away on the seabed. That's what caused the global DOC levels to drop so sharply.
Wow, okay, that's incredible. So the very evolution of life becoming slightly larger and more complex basically scrubbed the ocean clean of its own dissolved nutrients. It unintentionally starved the system by burying the carbon.
That's the core of the new hypothesis.
So complexity wasn't triggered by a massive carbon reservoir. The emergence of complexity caused the reservoir to shrink. That completely flips the cause and effect relationship we assumed for decades.
It's a fundamental reversal. It suggests life evolved despite the scarcity, and its evolution then actively drove that scarcity further. It gives us a totally new perspective on Earth's history during that time.
So when did the recycling kick back in?
Much later. It was only when oxygen levels eventually started to rise in the deep ocean, likely linked to those major oxygenation events, that the decomposition process could become efficient again. Only then could the system start effectively recycling those buried building blocks, allowing the DOC reservoir to slowly recover and grow toward the large volume we see today.
It really underscores how tightly linked the planet's biology and chemistry are. Okay, let's pivot. We've been deep in the primordial past, but let's bring this to the very modern future. This research obviously rewrites chunks of Earth's early history, which is fascinating for understanding life's origins here, maybe even on other planets. But what's the immediate pressing takeaway from this deep dive for us today on Earth?
Well, it gives us really valuable insights into planetary resilience, how the whole Earth system, especially the carbon cycle, responds to major disturbances. And let's be honest, right now, human activity is the major disturbance.
And there's a direct analogy brewing, isn't there? You mentioned the low oxygen levels in the ancient deep sea.
Exactly. We're seeing a worrying trend today. Marine oxygen levels are declining globally. This is driven by climate change. Warmer water holds less oxygen, and also by pollution, like nutrient runoff from agriculture, which causes algal blooms that consume oxygen when they decay.
We call them dead zones.
Right, these expanding low oxygen zones. In effect, we are starting to recreate some of those ancient anoxic deep sea conditions in various parts of the ocean.
So if the ancient mechanisms showed that low deep sea oxygen led to this massive long-term burial of carbon, essentially shutting down recycling,
Yeah.
could we be inadvertently setting up the conditions for that to happen again?
That is the really serious implication here. The researchers behind this study explicitly state that it cannot be ruled out. The same fundamental mechanism where a lack of deep-sea oxygen cripples the ocean's ability to recycle its dissolved carbon could potentially begin to operate again, perhaps over very long timescales in the future because of what we're doing now.
That's quite a sobering thought. It's not just about fish struggling to breathe in dead zones.
No, it's about potentially altering the fundamental chemical cycling of the entire planet. By changing oxygen levels, we could be messing with the ocean's basic ability to maintain its own vast nutrient reservoir.
It makes you realize the knock-on effects of climate change and pollution are way more complex than just, say, rising temperatures or ocean acidification. We could be fundamentally changing how the planet stores and cycles carbon.
Absolutely. This ancient story highlights a critical planetary leverage point. If you significantly inhibit decomposition in the deep sea, even partially, but over long enough periods, the consequences for global carbon storage and ultimately for the biological resources that depend on that dissolved carbon could be profound.
What a journey. Okay, so to wrap this deep dive up, these incredibly tiny, seemingly ordinary egg-shaped stones, ooids, no bigger than sand grains, they held the key. They gave us a direct chemical measurement from over 500 million years ago.
And that measurement showed the ocean's chemistry during an absolutely pivotal time for life's evolution was the complete opposite of what scientists had assumed for decades.
Yeah, forcing a huge rewrite of how we connect the dots between carbon, oxygen, ice ages, and the rise of complex life itself.
Indeed. The big takeaway, I think, is that life changes its environment just as profoundly as the environment shapes life. It's a two-way street. But maybe here's a final question for you to think about, something to mull over.
Okay.
If this current decline in marine oxygen that we're causing does start to mimic those low oxygen conditions of the ancient past, what other maybe secondary unforeseen consequences beyond just the warming effects we already talk about might we be setting in motion? What happens when you start messing with the ocean's fundamental ability to recycle its own building blocks on a massive scale? Where does all that carbon go if it stops being efficiently recycled in the water column?
That's definitely food for thought. A powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest geological and biological revolutions, and maybe the biggest future risks, can hinge on the chemistry hidden inside something as small as a grain of sand.